do you have an extra copy of the final 2 pages of the instructions? I have most of them left.
I can put them up.
That would be great.
The final 2 pages meaning...
The ones you're reading this morning.
Oh, yes. Give me just a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to hand you 2.7 closing argument, which I will read before closing arguments. Then I will hand you a copy of 3.13, submitting case to jury, and then the dismissal of alternate jurors. Those are the 3 that I'm reading today.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Can I just see if
Sure.
Is the TV on? Or?
It is. I don't think your computer takes
Click
you
the
back.
laptop?
Put it auxiliary.
Should be the HDMI. Okay, so now if I want to do it so it's the whole thing, like that.
Ready? Okay, very good. Reading the jury.
All rise, jury entering.
All right, everyone have a seat. Welcome back, members of our jury. We are ready to proceed. Last night, did any of you read, watch, listen to any news accounts, do any independent investigation on your own about this case, or speak with anyone about this case?
No.
Okay, very good. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, both the state and the defendant have now rested their case. The attorneys will now present their final arguments. Please remember, however, that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instruction on the law. But please do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding this case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide this time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defense has given its closing argument. State.
May it please the court. To attack, rape, and murder this little girl, this defendant had to get access to her. He had to get his hands on her. He couldn't go to her house on Ida Street and take her. She was surrounded by her family, by her mother and her sisters. And ultimately, there was a person in between him and that little girl that he wanted to get alone so that he could do these vile things to her. To do that, he had to get that person out of the way. And even though these are violent, brutal crimes that he committed on this little kid, he didn't use violence to get that obstacle out of the way. He used a much more sophisticated and a much more subtle technique. He used deception. He used lies. He used manipulation. He pulled strongly at the heartstrings of Ebony Wiley. The heartstrings that he had developed, that he had cultured, that he had nurtured by telling her how he loved her. And I'm going to marry that girl. Remember what he told Detective Staley, Detective Carroll, in his own statement out of his own mouth. So he pulled hard at those heartstrings. And he manipulated this young 23-year-old woman into leaving this little girl in his care and custody. But the lies, the deception, the manipulation didn't stop there. It continued throughout that night. As he then spun another web of lies and deceit to keep himself out of the picture, to give himself time to get rid of her, time to destroy evidence, precious time that law enforcement would have needed to stop him from throwing her body in the bay. He utilized that lie that he nurtured throughout that night, through Ebony Wiley, through his own mother. A lie that he continued into the evening, into the early morning hours of the 17th. And when he got up the next morning around 10:30 or 11, he continued to nurture that lie between his mother and Ebony, trying to bolster it up and support it, because that's what distanced him from this vile crime that he committed on this little girl. Tell them it was my mother. Tell them that you brought her to my mother. Because if you tell them you brought her to a man, they're going to think you're a horrible godmother, appealing to her own self-interest, her own self-preservation. This mastery of manipulation that we saw in this case, not only over Ebony Wiley, but over his own mother and over multiple other people, vulnerable people that he manipulated and used. And these lies continued. It continued all the way through the phone to the detectives at the Temple Terrace Police Department. It continued in a statement that you all saw just a couple of days ago, a videotape statement, where the defendant continued to lie about where he was, lie about what he was doing, and lie about what he did to this little girl, what happened to her, to these detectives who made it very clear to him that they were investigating the disappearance of this little girl and how important it was for them to find her, to find out, make sure she's okay. And he continued to lie to her. And the manipulation didn't stop. It continued throughout that night. It continued into the next day. It continued into the weeks after. And as we saw in just the last couple of days, the manipulations and the deceit have continued all the way to now in this courtroom, 5 years later. But make no mistake about it, when he finally got his hands on Felicia Williams, this was about raw lust and violence and perversion. That's what this case is about. The rape of a 9-year-old third grader. When he got his hands on her, she didn't stand a chance against this grown man sitting over here. This 35-year-old man at the time. This little 9-year-old girl didn't stand a chance against him. Once her godmother was out of the picture, once Ebony Wiley had left, she was all alone. In his care, in his custody, and his mercy. And this defendant didn't hesitate. The evidence in this case is crystal clear. And it's been proven to you beyond any doubt that Granville Ritchie raped, strangled, brutalized, and murdered Felicia Williams. And they threw her in the bay. The defendant is charged with the capital murder of this child. A child, the most vulnerable citizens we have in our society, children. He's charged with capital sexual battery. Capital sexual battery, i.e., raping a child under 12. The state has proven its case to you beyond any doubt.